and good morning. This is Kelsey from Kels Reads Things at Anna Porter Public Library in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And today I am very excited to be discussing with you Invisible Differences, a story by Julie Diaz Chez something. Excuse me, she's French. I can't pronounce her name correctly. And it is illustrated by Mademoiselle Caroline. This story is about a young woman named Marguerite who lives in France, and she is a 20 something. I believe she's about 27, and she has been living her entire life feeling as though she doesn't quite fit in. Invisible Differences is a graphic novel that touches on and introduces the reader to autism, the diagnosis, and what all of that entails. It was originally only published, I believe, in France, and it has since been thankfully translated to English. So kudos for that. This is a very informative read. I was very happy with the fact that there was a story that goes along with the purpose of the book, which is to introduce, again, readers to autism and basically to show you firsthand what an experience would be for a person who is autistic and is not aware of it. Marguerite is shy, she's introverted. As I mentioned, she's about 27 and she works in a large office in France. And unfortunately, with large offices comes lots of noise and hoopla, all kinds of chaos that she has to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And poor Marguerite just wasn't built that way. She becomes easily overwhelmed by all the noises and just by all the energy that she is surrounded by in her day-to-day life. She has a complicated relationship with her boyfriend who doesn't really understand her need to plan every single outing that she goes on that she wasn't anticipating. For instance, if he wants to go out to drinks with friends on a Friday night and she wasn't informed about it ahead of time, most likely she will not join him. And that creates a lot of obvious conflict between her and her boyfriend. There's also obviously concerns with her and her friends who tend to kind of downplay her concerns, because Marguerite throughout this book is starting to realize that she's not neurotypical, which is a term that people use to describe people who do not suffer with or who are not neurotypical is a term used to describe people who are not diagnosed with autism and for the most part have accepted normal social abilities, I guess is the best way to say it. Whereas neurotypical people are on the autism spectrum, and they do tend to be more introverted. They become exceedingly overwhelmed by just lots of stimuli. If there's too much going on in their environment, they'll become extremely overwhelmed to the point where they're almost sick. So it was really interesting to see Marguerite kind of notice some things about herself, things that she's always known, and she's always known that she's a little bit different than her cohorts, than her peers. But after one instance with her boyfriend where they're going on a weekend trip and she just can't do it, she realizes that maybe it's time to do some research and figure out kind of if there are other people who can relate to her, and she does. She eventually contacts a facility that does testing for people who are on the spectrum, and it takes a long time, but she gets her results and she finds out that she is autistic, specifically has Asperger's. However, Asperger's is no longer a scientific term for people who are on the autism spectrum. It was just a term that used to be contributed to that, but I don't believe it is anymore. And once she discovers like her own identity, she becomes a driving force and a speaker for people on the autism spectrum, because I was not aware of this, but France apparently at the time that this book was written, which is not too many years ago, unfortunately are really behind when it comes to their education and the care of people who are on the autism spectrum. They have very little knowledge and very little programs to support families who have people who are diagnosed. And it's actually loosely based on the real life experience of the author as well as the illustrator. They met at one point and she told her about her story and they made it a reality. So it's actually kind of a memoir, which was really awesome. Okay, so now that I've talked about the basic plot and the things that happen in the graphic novel, now I'd like to talk a little more about the imagery and some specific things about the book that I liked. Personally, I gave it 5 stars. It was a very entertaining book. It was very colorful by the end. That's something I should mention in the beginning. You'll notice that there is very, very little color, aside from maybe a splash of red from here and there, maybe a splash of yellow. But for the most part, Marguerite's life, what I got from that is saying that it's pretty dull, and she feels pretty isolated, I would say, in the beginning of the book, because again, she feels as though no one really understands her, and that's fair considering the fact that she's diagnosed with autism. And another thing is her workplace does not take her seriously throughout the novel. They don't really want to accommodate for her condition, and thanks to that, she eventually goes off and does something better for herself. By the end of the book, there is all kinds of color. You see it everywhere. And that communicates to me that she is much happier. I even noticed that she's wearing brighter colors by the end of the novel. So that was awesome. How her world, just from understanding herself better, went from this dark, black and white, kind of uncertain sort of realm to a world of color and light and obviously joy and happiness, and that was wonderful to see on page. I liked how the more intense scenes were highlighted with lots of reds and bold colors to indicate that it was an intense scene. I really personally love that Marguerite, once she got her diagnosis, just like ran with it. She was ready to tell the entire world about autism and why more people on the spectrum should be accommodated in their countries, and there should be more programs, more information, more education about the diagnosis. And it really does act as a guide, especially for people who have not ever been necessarily exposed to autism or don't even know really what the symptoms are or what to look out for, or even don't even understand people who are on the spectrum. This is a wonderful book that highlights and explains the condition in a very cut-dry manner. And it tells it in a story format, so you're more, I think the reader is more invested in the topic overall because of how it's presented to the reader. And another thing I just want to mention about the author herself, in 2016 she became the first openly autistic person to defend a thesis on the subject of autism in France. So go her. That's amazing. Marguerite also has 2 cats and a dog, and they make several appearances in the book, and anyone who knows me knows I love animals, so that was awesome to see. The illustrations were relatively simple, but they were and not overly complex, so there were times when I couldn't always tell like which character was which, because her boyfriend, I think his name was Fabian, something like that. He looked a lot like a few other characters that she ran into, so it would take me a second. I'm like, wait, is that her neighbor or is that her boyfriend? But overall, it was a beautiful story. It was a guide, and it was definitely necessary and diverse, and I think it's something that every library needs to have. That was my very brief but obviously exciting review of Invisible Differences. I thoroughly enjoyed this graphic novel. I read it very, very quickly, and I recommend it to anyone who is curious about learning a little more about people who operate slightly differently than ourselves. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic Friday. I look forward to next week when I'll be discussing What's Not to Love. a adorable rom-com about straight A students, type A individuals who are enemies but eventually become something more. Have a good one.